What's up guys, Justin Greenwald here with 65drums.com. Today I'm going to show you how to EQ your drum set. This is part of a series of videos I'm doing. I've got other videos, how compression works, how soundboards work, how direct boxes work. They're all in a playlist on my channel if you want to learn more of those basic sound design stuff that a lot of drummers should know at one point in their career. Alright, so before I explain to you how I use EQ, here's where you can find it on a soundboard. Over to my left, this soundboard has 4-band EQ. You've got high, you've got mid-high, low-mid, and low. So each of those knobs control different frequency bands of the sound that's coming through the soundboard. Think of them as gates or filters over the sound. So the high and the mid-high filters, or EQ knobs, they control basically the kind of sounds that you would hear a lot in your cymbals, and even like the high-pitched sound of the slapping of your snare, and the slapping of your kick pedal against your drum head on your kick drum. Those are like the high frequencies. The low frequencies are basically like the subwoofery type sounds, your kick drum, your floor toms, and even the rest of your toms, the body of your snare. Those are all low frequencies. And the mids, they sit right between those two. The mids are like the aggressive part of your sound. If you turn up the mids too much, it makes your drum set sound like you recorded it in a garage. It sounds awful. But if you turn down the mids too much, everything sounds really, really sterile, over studioized. It sounds a little too clean and unnatural. So you got to strike a balance, and of course, it depends on what kind of sound you're going after. Let me just explain to you some of my philosophies about EQing. First off, I'm going to use the analogy of walking into a dimly lit room with a flashlight. Whenever you point the flashlight at specific aspects of the room, you're highlighting it. You're drawing attention to that part of the room. That also goes for sound. Whenever you increase like the highs of your snare, you're drawing the attention of the audience to a certain aspect of that snare. The reason why I bring this up is that you want to be careful. If you turn off the EQ of everything, the highs, the mids, and the lows, you're just drawing everyone's attention to everything. It doesn't make any sense. It's a wall of sound. So just make sure that you're trying to find something that you want to highlight, a characteristic of the snare that's already there that you're trying to highlight. And don't go overboard, because when you turn off the EQ, either the lows, the mids, or the highs too much, not only does the original character of that sound slightly become obscure and degraded, not only that, but you're also increasing the overall volume of that sound a little too much. So you might start with a volume of something like this, and by the time you're done EQing your entire drum set, your volume is like this. It'll give the sound man fits at your gig. So just don't turn up the EQ of everything too much. Just be conservative with it. Now, before I explain to you how I would EQ different individual drums, let me just give you the disclaimer that take this all with a grain of salt. Even when I tell you how I'll EQ a snare, it really depends on the specific snare. Because if you've got one snare that's made of mahogany and it's tuned really, really loose versus a snare that's tuned really, really tight and it's made of steel, I might EQ both of those snares differently. Just keep in mind, this is how I approach EQing my drums for the sound that I'm trying to create. So hopefully this will help you find the sound that you're trying to create. All right, so let's talk about the snare first. And I'll bring up those two examples. You got like a big mahogany snare that's tuned really, really loose. It will sound pretty bassy, and the sound might be a little unfocused. So in that case, in my electronic drum module, or if it's a real acoustic drum set on the soundboard, I would probably turn up the highs just a little bit to bring some attack to the sound. And if it sounds a little too bassy because of how big it is and it's made of wood and it's tuned really loose, I might actually decrease the lows a little bit. The snare is one of the most important drums in your entire drum set. Kick and snare is like a 1-2 punch. It's what shines through the mix. If you listen to any song on the radio, the two instruments from the drum set that you're going to hear are the kick and the snare. So you want to spend a lot of time trying to get it right. So let's say I was EQing that steel snare that was tuned really, really tight. In this case, I might want to bring up the lows a little bit to give it some body and depth and make it sound a little more powerful, because that's the sound I'm going for. And if it's tuned really high, maybe the high frequencies are a little too out there, they're a little too sharp sounding. I might have to turn down the high frequencies just a little bit. The mids in this case, it's really up to you. If you can control like a 4-band EQ on that snare, you might say that you want to increase the mid highs just a little bit. It brings a bit of aggression to the sound, but you don't want to turn it up too much or else your snare will sound like it was recorded in a garage. All right, so let's talk about the kick drum now. The kick drum obviously is very important to your sound. And mostly what I do is I increase the bass. I turn up the low EQ. Sometimes I'll turn up the highs just a little bit so you get that, that click, that slapping sound that you hear when the beater hits the drum head of the kick drum. Sometimes I want to highlight that, especially if you're doing some sort of metal kick drum. But a lot of times just the kick drum doesn't sound big enough. And this happens especially if you're starting off with a kick drum sound and the kick drum that you're modeling is small, then you'll have to increase the lows to compensate if you want a bigger, more powerful sound. And this is another thing I want to point out. You can only work with what you've got. So EQ can only do so much. If you're working with a tiny little kick drum and you want it to sound like a monster, it's going to be really hard. You're going to be pushing the lows up so much that the kick drum loses its original character. And it's going to sound big and boomy and all this stuff. So what you might want to do is just go switch to another kick drum sound within your drum module. Or if you have an actual kick drum, you're playing an acoustic drum set, maybe you should just change the drum head. That can do wonders. Or tune it a little differently. So with the kick drum, I usually increase the lows, and sometimes I'll increase the highs just a little bit. So let's talk about the crash cymbals. For me, what I'm going for in a crash cymbal is something with fast attack, and I want a wall of sound. So if I was using an acoustic cymbal, it might be something like one of those Sabian cymbals with all the holes cut out in it, something that is very bright sounding and has fast attack. And the way I highlight that when I EQ it is by turning up the highs a little bit and the mids a little bit as well. And I'll leave the low EQ alone. And if it's like a really thick cymbal or a really big cymbal, you might actually have to turn down the lows a little bit because it just brings too much body to the sound. I just want a fast white noise to come in when I hit a crash cymbal. Again, it depends on which crash cymbal, because I'll have a larger crash cymbal, maybe a smaller crash cymbal, maybe a China cymbal. I approach those maybe slightly differently from each other. But mostly I'll increase the mids a little bit and the highs a little bit when I'm EQing a crash cymbal. For my toms, I approach it very similarly to how I approach my kick drum. I'll usually increase the lows a little bit, and if I'm just not getting the attack, if I'm not getting that initial impact sound that I want, I'll increase the highs a little bit. It really depends on how you want to approach your drum set. When I'm playing a lot of rock songs or rap songs, I want to have definition to my toms. I want to hear them clearly as I'm doing a fill. I don't just want a big boomy sound every time I hit my kick drum or my toms. So that's why sometimes I'll increase the highs a little bit just to give it some clarity. Again, don't go overboard when you're EQing anything. Especially with the cymbals, you may be tempted to increase the highs or the mids a little too much in the cymbals, and it just becomes freakishly annoying. It may sound okay in your headphones, but when you play out live with it, it just sounds like trash. So again, it depends on what genre of music you're EQing your cymbals for. So that's how I EQ my drum set. Again, this will vary from person to person, and I'm not saying I'm amazing at EQing my drums. This is just as far as my skills have progressed. I used to be really, really awful at EQing, and no one can give you a template on how to EQ your specific drum because every single sound is different. And one thing I haven't touched on is that a lot of drum modules will just let you EQ the entire drum set, not individual pieces. In that case, you can't do as much individual customization. To cover that, I just say that I will increase the low end a little bit and the highs just a little bit. It really depends on which drum set you're EQing. Obviously, I'll EQ a rock drum set to be a little more low heavy and maybe a jazz drum set to be a little more heavy in the highs. I don't know. It depends on each individual drum set. And you're gonna have to experiment a lot over the period of several years to get better and better and better at using the EQ. The more you fiddle around with it, the more you experiment. Just a couple of things again I want to remind you of. Don't turn up the EQ too much. It degrades the original quality of the sound and you're pushing it beyond what it was meant to be. If you are finding that you're trying to push like a small kick drum to sound too big by increasing the lows too much and it's starting to sound all weird, just switch to a different kick drum sound that is more in line with what you're going for. That's the power of an electronic drum module. The second thing is that remember, you're trying to point out specific attributes of the drum that you're EQing. It's there, it's just slightly hidden, and so that's why you're using the EQ. You're bringing to light attributes of the drum that is already there, not trying to force an attribute that isn't there. So just keep those two things in mind, and I hope that helped. Thanks for watching. I hope this video helped. I make a new video about electronic drums every single Sunday, sometimes an extra video in the middle of the week when I have time. My drumming news is on Facebook. Drum covers are on Instagram. My drum articles are on my website. See you guys next week.